Hello and welcome to another episode of FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am a writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence and an advocate for men's mental health. In today's episode, I talk to Ben Moroski from the US, who is an inspiration to us all. His battle over the years with self-harm is frightening, but told with a candidness and a self-awareness that I'm honoured to hear. I must, however, issue a trigger warning for this video, as we do get into self-harm in some detail. If you are a victim of self-harm or you could be triggered, then please don't watch. If you do watch this video, I hope you find it interesting. Before I go, please like and subscribe. The more the channel grows, the more people I can help. Thanks, take care, peace. Welcome, Ben, to FTD Talk.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm really excited to talk to you. Can we start by just you telling me a little bit about who Ben Moroski is?
Yeah, I'm a writer and an actor based in Los Angeles, California. Yeah, I spend part of my time as well on social media and in person doing mental health awareness work, mainly geared around having dealt with self-injury in the past, as well as depression and other things like that I've struggled with. But self-injury still lives on the fringes of society and for the most part, so I try to bring awareness to it in a way that talks about it in a healthy way and hopefully a positive way. Because I spent so many years feeling so much shame and living kind of in the shadows with regard to it, that my goal is always to help people feel like they can open up. Yeah. And then some of the work that I do in the film and writing stuff, I do tend to gear toward mental health as well. So, yeah, just write about what inspires me. And a lot of time is inspired by what I've been through. So.
Awesome. And can you remember the very first time that you self-harmed?
Yeah, it was, I think I was 17. I grew up in an extremely religious environment, essentially what amounts to a cult, Bible-based, but very guilt and shame oriented. So lots about, everyone's inherently a sinner, and all we can do is sin unless we're a Christian. But even once you were a Christian in this environment, it was still very much an oppressive environment. So I was just racked with guilt and shame about anything really that they labeled as wrong or bad. So when I was 17, I obviously was starting to masturbate, and or I guess had been masturbating for since puberty, and as one does, and but it was that was a sin. So I remember when I was 17, I kind of got to the I wouldn't say the end of my rope. I think that came a little later, but I got to a point where I was like, I need to do something. I need to show God that I'm committed to doing the right thing. I need to also punish myself for having done the wrong thing. And for whatever reason, I got a razor blade out of a disposable shaving razor, and I cut a cross into my right palm. Yeah, and that was the very first time that I self-harmed. It didn't become a chronic thing right then, but I remember vividly that was the very first time that I did.
So the first time that you did was kind of like self-flagellation then?
Yes.
It was a religious thing. It wasn't to punish yourself for anything.
It was definitely to punish myself for having sinned. So I suppose it's self-flagellation and also, but it wasn't so much ritualistic. It was definitely had an element of self-punishment to it.
And did you tell anybody that you'd done it? Did anybody notice the cut on your hand?
No, the cut wasn't that bad, and I definitely didn't tell anyone. At the time, it was like I had never been exposed to self-injury. I didn't know what it was. It wouldn't have even been something that crossed my mind as something that was out there. I just made a decision to do that, and I did it.
And how did it escalate from there? And what were the triggers?
It escalated toward the end of my senior year of high school, which would have been later that year. I started, and again, I just I don't know why it was, growing up in an environment where everything was either where so many things were labeled as sin, so many outlets. Sex was wrong, alcohol was not okay, drugs were not okay, and I was always a really good rule follower. Um, so so I didn't do any of those things. I didn't act out in any of those ways. But for whatever reason, I found self-injury, and it was something that was outside the bounds. Was no one had ever talked about it, no one had ever labeled it as I mean, no one had talked about it, so there was no label on it. So it became an outlet. And I, started small and started what amounted to kind of experimenting with it, I suppose, even though I didn't really know what I was doing and I didn't have a name for it. But I would, cut my stomach because it was easier to hide. And, it wasn't anything very deep, but it was something that was my own, and I think the triggers were, um, again, stress, being in that environment, being in that cult environment, the guilt and the shame. And then also, I think getting toward the end of school and figuring out what to do next and not knowing what to do next and feeling kind of trapped. So I think that a lot of different stressors contributed to needing an outlet that was mine, and I think there was an element of the self-punishment, and then I think it also developed into an element of being able to control something
Yeah.
as well.
So some of the stresses were what people would consider just everyday life then. Why do you think that stressed you? Was it because of the religious environment you were in?
Definitely that was part of it, and then I think also at that around that time, I'm sure my struggles with depression were also beginning to present, and I didn't really know what that meant or what that looked like. It's funny, I feel like with mental health, a lot of the time, at least in my experience, and that's really all I can speak to, things always have tended to sneak up on me.
Yeah.
It's not like, oh my God, here comes depression. It's
Yeah.
more like I look back and I'm like, oh shit, I was severely depressed for that period of time, or it really started to show up. And I look back now and I think, man, I think I was really starting to deal with that as well in this same time period. So it was kind of a perfect storm of different elements, and I think the day-to-day stressors were kind of the backbeat of the whole thing, just kind of like bearing down a little bit.
And I hate the phrase a cry for help.
Yeah,
I hate that phrase because when I was self-harming,
yeah,
nobody knew about it. I didn't talk about it, and I didn't cut myself. I'd like punch myself in the face, or kick a table with no
yeah.
shoes on, anything just to hurt myself. And I didn't tell anybody. Did you? Did you tell anybody? Was yours um, desperation, dealing with, like you say, depression, or did you need help?
I mean, I definitely needed help, but I didn't tell anyone the until after I graduated high school. It was the Monday after I graduated high school. And again, it's one of those incidents that I remember very vividly. I that was the first time I really reached the end of my rope. And I don't think it was genuinely a suicide attempt. I think it was definitely more still dealing with self-injury, but in a more intense way. It had continued to get more intense as I finished up school. I was cutting deeper. I was cutting more around my down my arms and around my wrists. And I just left the house one day and in the car and was driving around town. And I grew up in a small town. I was driving around town and I ended up parking and I had a razor blade with me and I cut myself pretty bad. I cut my wrist pretty bad. And it was one of those things where I I didn't I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't that day, like I didn't know what I had set out to do. So ultimately after a couple hours I drove back home. But I had blood all over me um and I ended up back home and I parked across the street and my mom came out of the house cuz she didn't know where I'd been. I didn't have a cell phone. And She came over to the car and basically that was the first time that my parents had explicit exposure to what I'd been starting to go through. I also hate the phrase cry for help because I feel like it's used in a way that gets people off the hook. People try to, it's like, oh, it's just a cry for help. My thought is, hey, maybe if someone's crying for help, you should fucking help them.
Yeah.
So maybe the ball's in your court at that point, and you should start to ask questions. But it tends to be used, obviously, like you're saying, I just think it allows people space to get off the hook.
What was your parents' reaction to that?
My parents, and I do not take it for granted, have always been through all of this since I was 17. I'm now 33. Has been incredible.
Good.
Obviously, and I think what I mean by that, and even going back to that incident, was they never took it out on me, whether it was their fear, their frustration, their not knowing what it was or how to wrap their head around it.
Yeah.
My mom took me inside and helped me clean up and made sure the injury wasn't too bad and that I didn't need more medical attention, which I didn't. Um, and yeah, and she was able, through some internal strength of her own to keep from taking it out on me, because I know I have friends who've dealt with self-injury and their parents have had the very understandable reaction of extreme frustration, anger, um but I really, give a lot of credit to my parents that they've provided a space of unconditional love, which I think is so rare, but I think is really key for anyone trying to navigate self-injury with someone, is doing your best to create that space.
Yeah, I think if somebody reacts with anger, then that makes it about them, not about the person who's
Mm,
self-harming.
that's a good point. Yeah.
And with your self-harm, was it just cutting?
No, I mean, it started as just cutting, but it ran across the board. I mean, mainly cutting and burning. Um, but then just also things that you said, punching myself, that sort of lashing out as well. but mainly it's definitely, I've, experimented with a lot of different avenues of self-harm, but cutting and burning have been my main two ones that have popped up chronically.
And because I've seen photos of yourself because you're quite happy to pose without a shirt or in short sleeves now and show the scars.
Yeah.
Do you think that it self-harm became an addiction, became your go-to?
Yeah, I think it definitely became an addictive behavior. I, there's an endorphin rush related to going through, the aftermath of pain, and that sort of release became, um, I think, addictive. I also think that control factor of it being something that I could control. I also, for whatever reason, you know, um, if I start, it becomes hard to stop in the moment.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think there's definitely an addictive element to it for me, for sure.
And what kind of things triggered you? What you mentioned some things earlier on, but was there anything in particular that triggered you?
Yeah, because we ended up leaving the cult that I grew up in when I was 21. So I spent the first 21 years of my life there. We did end up leaving, which was, I think, still the most significant event in my life, because it was, yeah, I mean, frankly, it was just life changing. Gave me an opportunity, gave everyone in my family an opportunity to sort of figure out who we were outside of that environment and independent of that, and allowed for a lot of, normal self discovery. But I think a lot of those triggers from within that environment hung with me. I still deal with, you know, guilt and shame, even though it's less connected to religion. But when if something's grooved into you from for the first 21 years of your life, it's really hard to shake. Um, I think also, continuing to deal with depression has been a trigger. And then, yeah, the if day-to-day stressors get too big, or if there's added stress factors, that's also a trigger. Like,
Yeah.
say I got into a pretty, like, intense argument with someone, um taking it out on myself would alleviate the stress of having got into that argument, more than just being able to blow it off and, like, oh, shit happens. And it's like, no, for me, there's a shit happens, but I have to find a way to deal with that shit, and I'm probably the problem. So I need to take it out on myself, and then I also need to control my environment, and take back, sort of like, if I'm knocked off kilter by an argument, or by a life event, sort of taking back control of the environment. And yeah, and then, like I said about the environment I grew up in, I think it's also true for self-injury, having dealt with it. And I'm in a good place now, but having dealt with it since I was 17 all the way through my 20s, you groove something into the way you cope with stress, or different stressors or different triggers, for that long, it's going to be the knee-jerk reaction, at very least, in how I think. It's like, that's where my first thought goes, is to self-injury, even today. And I feel like I'm in a good place. I haven't self-harmed in some time, and I feel very grounded, but I can't say that I don't think about it daily, you know, and
Yeah.
that's and that's just kind of part of it, for me, is coping with those thoughts as well.
Wow. So even today, even now, you're in a good place, which is a great thing. You're still thinking about it.
Yeah, it just pops into my head, you know. Um, and most of the time it's passive thoughts. It's not like, "Ooh, how am I going to do it?" or "When am I going to do it next?" But whether it be images of, you know, wounds or impulses um to do it, just sort of like things just flash up in my mind, you know. And since I'm in a good place, most of the time they just kind of don't have to attach anything to them. They are what they are, and I'm able to let them go. But they definitely still pop up. So, and I don't think that has to be a depressing thing, or um, I think I think it's just I would say, just to encourage people, like, you can get through self-injury, and even if you're dealing with thoughts about it, one of my big things is, man, if you can get to the point of, I don't have to beat myself up for beating myself up,
Yeah.
then it's a win, you know?
And there's a lot of talk about mental health. That's the conversation is everywhere now.
Yeah.
And to some extent, there's people talk about suicide, but not many people talk about self-harm. Why do you think that is?
It's a great question. Um, I still think that people don't know what to do with it. Um, because I mean, just as an example, I still find it hard to have conversations with people who are dealing with self-injury themselves, as far as I don't know how to navigate helping someone
Yeah.
stop self-injure. It's still, to be on the other side of it, and for the shoe to be on the other foot. I mean, I've experienced, in small ways. I think about my mind goes back to my parents, and experiencing in small ways the frustration and the helplessness, um and all those feelings that must be, going through someone who's trying to navigate self-injury, with someone who's dealing with it. So I think I don't think people know where to put it. I think it obviously gets lumped in with suicide a lot of the time. Yeah, I think it's just hard to label. And I think if we don't, and I think I don't think it's a good thing, but I think if we aren't able to label something as something, if we can't put it into a defined box, then it becomes really hard to have a conversation about it. And my goal is to say that we don't have to label it. We can live in a world where there are more gray areas. Yeah, yeah, and what was I gonna say? Um, yeah, for I lost my train of thought, but yeah, I do think it's hard to define. So I think it's harder to have a conversation around things that are harder to define.
And talking about conversation, when you started to wear short sleeves
Yeah.
and you publicly showed your scars, what was the reaction of people around you? Did anybody approach you and ask you about them, or
Oh man, I was so nervous when I started wearing short sleeves. Because I hid for years, as far as like wearing long sleeves, and just desperately hiding them, being, mortified about having scars, and hating the fact that I did have scars, for years. And then I did a theater apprenticeship, on the East Coast of the US, and I was I was like, "Hey, I'm gonna be around people that I've never met before. I won't know anyone. I'm in a good place right now, and I'm gonna wear short sleeves, um, and I'm just gonna see how it goes." I was so stressed, but people were great. I mean, people either asked or they didn't ask. I mean, sometimes it felt more odd people not asking than people asking, because I'm like, I have scars down my arms, and it seems like I think people sometimes don't know what to say,
Mm.
which is fine. You don't have to ask. Um, but I always try to, when people do ask, if it feels like they're asking in a genuine way, I try to give a genuine response, which then 9 times out of 10 makes people uncomfortable for having asked. But I try to reassure people that it's totally fine. I wouldn't wear short sleeves if I wasn't comfortable talking about them,
Yeah.
about my scars. And I think to myself, I could be the one person that this person interacts with who's dealt with self-injury and who's made it through it and who's okay, talking about it. And if I can leave that person with a positive impression of, being able to overcome a mental health struggle, and that self-injury is out there. I think it's another reason why it's hard to talk about, is because it's viewed as so taboo. Um, but if they can see that a high functioning individual has dealt with it, um, and is comfortable wearing short sleeves, then maybe that'll help other people have more compassion, um, around it, and maybe the stigma will shrink one iota.
Yeah, it's like when I talk about male victims of domestic violence and what I went through.
Uh-huh.
Um, that's very stigmatized too. But I think if you're very matter of fact with what you say and very straightforward about it, people are shocked
Uh-huh.
by it.
Yeah. Yes.
Um, I want to read your words to you, words that helped me even. Um, you said that after a break of self harm, if you go back to it, you're not going back to square one. You're just on a different square.
Uh-huh.
And I thought that was a brilliant thing to say, because when I was self harm free for 4 years, and then I self harmed again, and I was devastated. I thought I'd let myself down, let everybody else down, and I thought 4 years have just gone by the wayside now that I've gone back to it. But your words are was inspirational to me, that it's not it's not that you've lost all that knowledge. You've just self-harmed again.
Yeah. Yeah. I forgot I wrote that. I mean, it's nice to hear it even for me, because it's, even though I'm in a good place, it's not like I don't self-harm from time to time still. I've never I've never been good at counting days, because for me personally, it ends up, putting pressure on me. Um,
Yeah.
of course, I like to accumulate time, having not self-harmed. Um, but explicit day counting I find it, to be pressurized. But I do think, yeah, I mean, yeah, square one. I think I spend a lot of time feeling like I was going back to square one, when I would self-harm. And um yeah, it really is a different square. What's the date? It's the 24th. The 26th, so 2 days from now, it'll be a year exactly since I went back into mental health treatment. Um, I went into treatment a year ago, almost today. I was back in treatment for a little over a month, and I remember thinking a year ago I was just so frustrated and felt so mortified and felt like I was back at square one. You know, but with a little space and some time, it's like, no, we can take care of ourselves, you know. Again, I think square one mentality leads to beating myself up for having beaten myself up. You know, I self-harm, and then for me it can become a cycle where, well, then I self-harm again because I've self-harmed. I need to punish myself for having done it, you know, or it just opens the floodgates of like, well, all bets are off, so I might as well do it. Um, but trying to take a more positive tack and realize that um no, I'm allowed to take care of myself. You know, and part of that taking care of myself is I'm allowed um to not throw the baby out with the bathwater and not throw those 4 years out,
Yeah.
you know? Because what good does that do? It's like you did good work. And you can do good work again. Um and it doesn't have to be. I would just, you know, implore people that, you know, with self-harm, it's like it's a trap if, you know, it's a trap um to kick yourself when you're down. Um and you know, it's easy to fall into the trap, and I've fallen into the trap, so it's not to say that again, that's another part of the trap, is to think if you've been caught by the trap that then, you know, all bets are off, and it's just a cycle, you know. So if
Yeah.
there's any like small way that I can break the cycle, um and reframe things. Yeah, of course, you can frame it like you're back to square one. But if I can reframe it that I'm just on a fucking square, you know, I'm just on a
Yeah.
square. It doesn't have to be, I don't need to give it a number.
Yeah.
Um, I don't need to give it a number. So, yeah, that's a long-winded tangent from what you said. But yeah.
And you talked there about going into treatment.
Yeah.
What was that like? Did it help?
Yeah, it was great. I mean, the my therapist at the time and my psychiatrist at the time last year, I've had to move on from both of them and find different treatment partners. That's a separate conversation, and both of those relationships ended well. But they helped me find this treatment center,
Mhm.
and and it was a good environment, and it definitely helped a lot. Um, I hadn't been in treatment in 8 years. So it was definitely one of those moments where I felt like I was headed backward, but really, you know, my therapist helped me reframe it, and to where, you know, just to remember, because it's so, I lose sight of this so easily, that it's okay to take care of yourself. Um, and mental health is just as important as physical health, and um yeah, it's okay to take care of yourself. And if part of taking care of yourself means going to treatment, going back to treatment, um, that's okay. And that's good. It's hard to go to treatment. Um, so if you're, you know, if you can be brave enough to take care of yourself in that regard, I really applaud you. Because we all, you know, deserve to be healthy, not only physically but also mentally, and it's so easy to neglect the mental side just because we can't see it, you know.
Um, there is one thing that I wanted to ask you about, and doing my research for this interview,
Yeah.
I come across some very disturbing material online. It seems to be a community of people who self-harm, posting photos, posting videos of them self-harming, and
Yeah.
it's almost bragging. Look what I can do. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that. And have you seen any of that?
Yeah, I've seen some of it and it's massively triggering, it's really hard to deal with. I think it's just a symptom of the world we live in as far as the proliferation of social media and that sort of thing. And I don't know what to do about it. I think it's unfortunate. I try not to judge people, especially not especially, but I try not to judge people dealing with self harm. I feel bad that there are communities like that out there because I think it does a disservice to um, people going through self harm because I think I see images like that and they make me want to self harm.
Yeah.
So I feel bad for people who maybe that's their first exposure to seeing to self-harm outside of their own experience, and things like that are a big reason why I try to be um explicitly outspoken whenever I post something. I try to anything I post, I try to do it with intention and with positive intention. And I try to be as real as I can be without being explicit. I know my scars are often labeled as explicit, which I personally disagree with. My posts have been flagged and taken down on platforms like Instagram before. I think if people read what I write, um, it would reframe how they view it. I also think I understand how my scars could be triggering for some people, and I don't take that lightly. At the same time, I spent so many years hiding my scars, and I know that there are people out there who are like me in that regard. And I think if I am at a place where I can share, and I don't think this applies across the board, so I don't mean it like that. But if I'm in a place where I can share me personally, I think it's partially my duty to share, because I want to be a positive influence, and it is such a stigmatized um, subject matter and behavior. And I think communities like the ones you're talking about and posts like the ones you're talking about only further stigmatize
Yeah. Yeah.
self-injury, which is unfortunate because I can see how easily it would be to get sucked down into that. So if I can be a glimmer of light for people, I try to be online.
Oh, I'm glad that you are. And what do you think needs to be put in place to help people who self-harm?
Man, that's a tough question. Because so many mental health systems are so fragmented. And um, I remember when I was going into treatment the first time, and my parents were sort of desperately looking around for treatment centers or things that dealt with self-injury, and there was nothing out there that really dealt with it explicitly, um, especially for a man dealing with it.
Mm.
um, I
Do
think
you think
it's
there's a gender difference then?
Well, I mean, statistically, it's not really a gender difference. It's about 60% female, 40% male from the statistics that I'm familiar with. So there's a large, chunk of the self-injury population that are male. I think it's very much stigmatized as female and teenage.
Yeah.
Um, but that's only a small fraction, and it's not to, of course, not to discount that population and their struggles, but there is a wide array of people who deal with self-injury. It doesn't discriminate at all. Um, but yeah, I mean, what needs to be put in place to help people with self-injury? I think the main thing that I would say, and this goes for things beyond self-injury, is continuing to destigmatize seeking mental health treatment.
Yeah.
Um, because that's the main thing that's helped me. Again, I can only speak to my experience, and in my experience, when I have felt less shame about going into treatment, seeking therapy, staying in therapy, um, being on medication, when I felt less shame about those things, I've been able to make greater strides. Uh, so I think whatever we can do, and I think it helps that people like us are outspoken and talking about these things. I do genuinely believe that even if it's in small ways, we are making a difference, and little ripples are important. Um, they're very important because they're also traveling across the water. It's
I,
not
s-
just the big ones.
I smile at that comment because that's what somebody told me the other day um, when I was a bit uh, down. They said that what you're doing is ripples in the water.
Yeah, I mean, if I can reach, if I can reach one person, I feel like I've made a difference because I didn't have anyone when I was starting to self-injure.
Yeah.
I didn't know anyone who'd been through it. I didn't know I had no exposure to it at all. And I think about myself when I was 17, if I had met someone like me now who dealt with it, would it have caused me to stop doing it? I don't know.
Mm.
But would it have given me, an exposure to it, where a healthy exposure to it? Yes. And I think that's what's most important is continuing to be, if I can continue to be a healthy exposure to making it through something like self-injury, I think that it makes a world of difference, even if it's just to one person. So, and hopefully it's more people, but yeah.
And you do express your thoughts through your art. Can you tell me a little bit about what you do with your
Um,
writing?
Yeah, some of it's more explicit as far as about self-injury than other things. It's some of the writing I'm doing currently is sort of a fictionalized. It's a working on a TV pilot that's a fictionalized take on my life and my struggle with self-injury. So I definitely approach things, some things more explicitly about my story. I also I tend to write a lot about self-destruction in a more general sense, and what drives us to self-destruct in different ways, because I think I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated by our capacity to blow our own shit up, um, and I think again telling stories like that does help, if we can continue to have conversations about why we self-destruct, and continue to show that there's hope beyond self-destruction, um, or even in the midst of it, that you can break cycles. I think it's important. And then, I also I try to, as I can, deal with try to collaborate with photographers and that sort of thing to show, positive images on online, just with regard to my scarring. I've been writing some poetry recently, which has been really interesting and beneficial, just to me personally, even to because I'm now at a place where a lot of my scars are fading. Um, and it's amazing how that can be how that's a new mental space for me. Where I started in a place where I was so ashamed of my scars, and then the pendulum swings as I've gotten comfortable to the place where I connect a lot of my identity with having scars. And now that they're fading, it's a kind of this other phase of, well, what do I do now with this fading part of my identity? Not that most of them will ever be gone, but just sort of wrapping your head around how life can change and identity can shift, and I think that can be triggering. But I think for me, art as a form of self-expression to not get to sort of have a vent for those triggers, and let steam off and express myself in ways that, I mean, art has really been life-saving for me in a lot of ways, because it does allow me to live in a gray area rather than in the black and white space that I think my mind inhabits a lot of the time.
Yeah. And do you think that your scars, because you've been living with them for such a long time, your scars fading, do you think that would trigger again? Do you
Yeah, I
feel
mean,
like
it
you're losing
definitely.
something of yourself?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It definitely is a trigger. So again, I think being aware that it is a trigger is helpful. But yeah, it definitely can be. Um, I think that's the tricky thing with triggers is they evolve, and can always evolve to meet us where we are, which which is really obnoxious. But but again, I think, if I can come at it from a place of compassion for myself, um, I think I have a fighting chance every time.
And going through self-harm for so many years, if you could just click your fingers now and all your scars disappear, would you do that?
That's a great question. No. And I don't have a great reason why. I think if I if I could go back and never have harmed myself,
Mhm.
sure, because it's caused a lot of pain and a lot of, if I could snap my fingers and not deal with depression, yeah, of course I would snap my fingers and not have dealt with those things. But as far as snapping my fingers and not having my scars, I just don't think I would do it. I don't think I would do it anymore. Again, I spent a lot of years where it was the only thing I wanted was to not have my scars. But now I think, they're a testament to the fact that, and not so much to me, but I think they're a testament to other people that you can make it through something like this. And if I can help break the stigma around scarring, because I feel like that's a separate conversation too. It's kind of
Yeah.
a separate wrinkle, to the conversation about self-injury. And if I can help break the stigma around scarring, and around the shame, and the embarrassment that lives around that, most of the time, I want to be a part of that, you know.
Yeah.
I want to be a part of that.
And finally, Ben, if people want to talk to you, they're going through self-harm,
Yeah.
how can they get in touch with you?
Best way to get in touch with me is just DMing me on Instagram. My handle is it's the first letter of my first name and then my last name. It's at B Moroski. It's BM as in Mary, OROSKI. I'm happy to have a conversation with anyone.
Cool. And what would be the single piece of advice? I know this is going to be really difficult, but the single most important piece of advice you can give to anybody who's self-harming?
Cultivating self-compassion, even if you're just starting with a tiny, the tiniest of seeds. It's so hard. Even if you have to start with someone else being compassionate for you. Again, I think it goes back to that, square one mentality. And it goes back to what I've said a couple times about not beating yourself up for beating yourself up. I think there's a chance. I think there's a chance to break cycles. Even if I just beat myself up once, I don't need to compound it with beating myself up again. If I can have compassion with myself, having self-harmed, and realize that is my way in that moment of trying to, in some way, my mind's way of trying to care for myself, even if it's unproductive, even if it's self-destructive. If I can have compassion, if I can live in that gray space of one of the best advice I got a number of years ago was that self-injury, it's neither right nor wrong. It's a behavior.
Mhm.
And it really freed me from having to beat myself up for self-injuring, because it's not wrong. It's a behavior. So if that can help anyone, have a little bit more compassion for themselves, self-compassion and compassion for others is really, what's going to free us from stigma and from these things that we struggle with. So that would be the convoluted advice I would I would give.
Well, Ben, I'm really glad that you're in a good place, and I think you're an inspiration to a lot of people.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, and I wish you all the best in the future.
Of course. Yeah, you as well. Thanks again.
Cheers, man. Take care.
Cheers. Sounds good.